مساء الخير. الجميع في صدمة مما يحدث في إيران، فللمرة الأولى منذ 40 سنة، يعني حينما سقط نظام الشاه وأسست الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية، ينتفض الشعب الإيراني بهذا الشكل الكبير والنافر والواضح والغاضب وبكثير من التحدي بسبب موت امرأة على إثر خلاف مع ما يعرف بالشرطة الأخلاقية. جدولة أو طفيرة كانت كفيلة لانفجار الغضب في صدور الإيرانيين اللي فيما يبدو ما بقى قادرين يتحملوا انهيار عملتهم ولا التضييق على الحريات ولا النظام البنكي الهش ولا الحصار الاقتصادي الدولي، رغم ثروات بلدهم الضخمة اللي ممكن تحطهم بين صفوف الدول الكبرى في العالم. لكن الساسة الإيرانيين ورطوا إيران في حروب الآخرين من أجل نفوذ دولي دفع ثمنه الشعب الإيراني من قوت يومه، والنتيجة تظاهرات عمت المدن الإيرانية لأكثر من 40 يوم وما زالت مستمرة، وما حدا بيعرف متى وكيف ستنتهي. ووفقا لوثيقة مصنفة سري للغاية، أكد اللواء حسين سلامي القائد العام لقوات الحرس الثوري الإيراني في تقريره المرفوع إلى السيد خامنئي أنه خلال الأسبوعين الأوليين من الانتفاضة في إيران تم اعتقال أكثر من 20,000 شخص. إذن ما يحدث في إيران خطير وسيؤسس عليه في السنوات القادمة، لأن اللهجة الاعتراضية صار صوتها عالي ومش من الهين إن تسكت. ضيفي الليلة في بتوقيت بيروت يطل علينا من واشنطن دكتور ستيفن شبينم. مساء الخير دكتور شبينم، وأهلا وسهلا بك في بتوقيت بيروت.
Thank you. Good morning.
دعني أبدأ بالمظاهرات والاحتجاجات في إيران بعد مقتل الشابة مهسا أميني. يعني للمرة الأولى تعلو أصوات الشعب الإيراني ضد السلطة، يعني بهذه الطريقة النافرة، يعني إذا جاز لنا التعبير. فما الذي يحدث في إيران من وجهة نظرك؟
Well, I think that for the first time in years now, we are seeing a very widespread, very broad-based popular uprising against the regime. We're seeing resistance not only to the theocratic aspects, that is the veiling requirements, the hijab requirement, all that, but we're also seeing a great deal of frustration with the apparent inability of the regime to run the country. So economically, the country is a disaster. Socially, it's a disaster. And, people have social media, they have access to the internet, and they're aware of what's happening in the rest of the world. And there's no reason why a country with the wealth, with the cultural traditions, with the artistic accomplishments of Iran, to be as backward as it has been forced to be under the regime. So we're seeing substantial pushback. Now, where it's going to go, obviously, we don't know. The regime certainly is capable of repressing or attempting to repress its own people. It's done that before. In fact, it's done that many times before. So whether that means that there will be increased bloodshed, we don't know that yet. I think that's a fairly, I can make that prediction with some confidence.
لكن الإيرانيون يواجهون مشكلة في التعبير عن أنفسهم وآرائهم منذ سنوات طويلة. يعني النظام الإيراني لا يسمح بالتعددية في الرأي، هذا واقع. أنا لا أقدم تحليل أو أعبر عن موقف سياسي. نحن هنا نتحدث عن الرأي الواحد في إيران منذ سبعينات القرن الماضي حتى الآن. يعني هل تغير شيء ما الآن، خصوصا أن النظام الإيراني مرتبك فيما يبدو وغير قادر على لملمة الشارع؟ هل قد يقود ذلك إلى تغيير ما في إيران؟
I don't think the regime will go down without a fight. I mean, they've been there a long time. They've been there almost half a century. And they have weapons and they know how to use them. Now, whether they will turn them against their own people on a massive scale, we don't know, but it would not be out of character for them to do that. How the street will then react is something entirely without precedent. Certainly, there have been demonstrations on the streets of Iran before. There have been uprisings, there have been protests, but this appears to be of a different level. And whether it catches the wave of popular opinion is yet to be seen. If it does, then it may very well lead to regime change.
حضرتك محامي لمجموعة من الإيرانيين اللي سبق واعتقلهم النظام بسبب آرائهم السياسية. ما الذي تستطيع أن تخبرنا عنه دكتور من خلال التجربة التي واجهوها كمعتقلين سياسيين في السجون الإيرانية اللي مشهورة بأنه سمعتها غير جيدة تنتهك حقوق الإنسان؟
In 1988, there was a widespread massacre of political prisoners, particularly at two prisons, Evin and Gardasht prisons, either in or near Tehran. And as many as 30,000 people, no one knows the actual number, but as many as 30,000 political prisoners were hanged at that time, and many others tortured, as a result of a crackdown that came from a fatwa issued by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And that crackdown led to particular persecution of the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, but other political prisoners as well, who were simply asked, do you continue to support the anti-regime forces? And if the answer to that question was yes, then people were let off to be executed on the spot within minutes. And one of the so-called judges, of course they weren't really judges, but one of the people who had the authority to send people to their deaths was none other than Ebrahim Raisi, who is today the president of Iran. So my clients, representing, these are loved ones of people who were killed in 1988 and also a few of the survivors of the 1988 massacre, have filed suit in New York City against Raisi personally, alleging that what he did injured them in violation of international law. And under United States federal law, the courts have the authority to hear cases like that, which is to say cases involving alleged injury committed in violation of the law of nations. And that is precisely what we're attempting to do. We have 16 plaintiffs. I think 4 of them were survivors and 12 of them had loved ones who were massacred in Tehran in 1988. And we are hoping that we can call Raisi to account personally for his personal involvement in those massacres. This is not a lawsuit against the regime. It's a lawsuit against Ebrahim Raisi.
لكنه رئيس جمهورية إيران الآن.
Yeah. Now, obviously, that poses certain difficulties from a jurisdictional point of view, from a legal point of view. But we think we can overcome those difficulties because while he has the title of president, he is certainly not the head of state of Iran. The head of state is the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader. As president of Iran, Raisi really has very limited powers. He's more a functionary than an executive. And for that reason, we think that he is not entitled to the personal immunity that heads of state or heads of government would ordinarily receive.
اعتبر النظام الإيراني أن المتظاهرين ضد الرئيس رئيسي في نيويورك خلال مشاركته في اجتماعات الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة بأنهم عملاء تعاونوا مع المخابرات الأمريكية في ثمانينات القرن الماضي وحاولوا الإخلال بالأمن في البلاد. لذلك تم اعتقالهم، يعني هن عم يربطوا اعتقالهم في تلك الفترة بما وصفوه بالخيانة.
Of course, that's the claim, naturally. Of course, it's always the CIA, it's always Israel, it's always the United States. It's never, the regime never looks in the mirror. And we know that. I mean, the word shame does not apparently translate into the regime's version of the Persian language. So, of course, they're going to have those sorts of defenses. But even if those things are true, which they're not, of course, but even if they were, they certainly don't justify the kind of mass murder that was carried out in 1988.
من خلال القانون الدولي كيف يمكن معاقبة رئيس جمهورية قد تثبت إدانته في هكذا اتهامات بعد انتهاء ولايته الرئاسية؟
Well, this lawsuit, the lawsuit that we have filed in New York City, is not an attempt to punish him. It's not a criminal case. It's a civil case. So if we were to succeed in this case, then Raisi would be condemned not to a term in prison or to any sort of criminal punishment, but to paying damages to the victims, to the plaintiffs. Now, would he actually pay those damages? Probably not. Does he have any assets that we can find in the United States or in a friendly country? We don't know the answer to that. But to answer your question, there is really no effective criminal prosecution possible. The only international tribunal capable of prosecuting war crimes is the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and Iran is not a party to the statute that set up the International Criminal Court, and therefore not subject to its jurisdiction. So the civil remedies may be the only game in town. It may not be possible, in the short run at least, to prosecute Ra'is. I suspect that if the world community were ever to come together and decide that these events needed to be punished, then it's always open to the United Nations to establish an ad hoc tribunal, as it's done in Lebanon, for example, or as it's done in Cambodia, and as it's done in Sierra Leone. But that is obviously for the future, and we're not counting on that.
أريد سؤالك عن السجون في إيران، وكلنا تابعنا ما حدث مع الفتاة مهسا أميني اللي تعرضت لاعتداء من الشرطة الأخلاقية الإيرانية بسبب أنه جزء من شعرها كان مبين. كيف تصف لنا واقع السجون والمعتقلات في إيران المتهمة بانتهاك حقوق الإنسان؟
It's difficult, of course, for anyone to learn about what's going on inside Iranian prisons because the prison authorities are hardly anxious to talk about it. But the reports that my clients are receiving suggest that conditions in Evin prison and Gordash and other prisons are dreadful. And nowhere close to meeting international standards with respect to adequacy of food, adequacy of shelter, adequacy of clothing, to the kinds of punishments that are meted out, to the use of solitary confinement, the use of physical punishment up to and including torture. All of those things are violations of international law. And in all of those cases, the international principles are binding on Iran. But Iran here's another drummer. The regime appears not to be responsive to any claims of human rights abuses. They simply deny them outright. Or, as you said a moment ago, they say, well, it's all because of the CIA or because of Mossad or because of some other enemy of the state which needs to be condemned.
تتحدث منظمة حقوق الإنسان بأن إيران ثاني دولة في العالم في تنفيذ حكم الإعدام بعد الصين. هل هذا صحيح؟
In terms of numbers, yes, after China. Yes, Iran is a very regular user of capital punishment for all sorts of crimes. Now, capital punishment, sadly, in my view, but there it is, capital punishment itself is not a violation of international law yet. I hope I live to see the day that it is. But certainly the ways in which capital punishment is carried out, the infliction of pain amounting to torture, the demonstration or the carrying out of executions in public so that the condemned can be mocked, can be made an example of. All of those things are prohibited in international law, and Iran simply ignores those rules.
من خلال القانون الدولي هناك اتهامات للحرس الثوري الإيراني وفي عقوبات صادرة بحقه على اعتبار أنه منظمة إرهابية. فكيف يمكن تعقب هكذا منظمات وأحزاب ومعاقبتها قانونيا؟
International law doesn't really address means of punishment, but it does permit, in some cases, the designation of organizations as terrorist, leading to domestic sanctions, that is, sanctions in individual countries that choose to condemn those organizations. So, for example, the United States considers the Revolutionary Guards Corps to be a terrorist organization. That's an interesting illustration because the IRGC is a government organization. Typically, what the U.S. considers to be terrorist organizations are renegade groups. They're rebel groups. That means that it can't have access to any assets it has in the United States. Its members cannot enter the United States. And there are various other kinds of economic and personal sanctions imposed on the group and on the group's supporters. It is now a criminal offense in the United States for someone subject to U.S. law to lend material support to the IRGC.
فعليا العقوبات الأمريكية بلا فائدة، وأدلل على كلامي من بلدي لبنان. فمثلا فرضت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية عقوبات على أفراد من حزب الله وشركات متعاونة معه، لكن فعليا ما تأثروا بهذه العقوبات الأمريكية. يعني مثلا وضع عقوبات على حساباتهم في البنوك، لكن حزب الله وأعضائه والمحاسبين فيه ونوابه وسياسيه ما عندهم أصلا حسابات بنكية، لذلك هذه العقوبات الأمريكية في الواقع عديمة الفائدة.
I don't think they're useless. They may not be as effective as would be possible in an ideal world, but unfortunately we don't live in an ideal world. So there are, although you're absolutely right that if an organization does not have assets in the United States, then freezing its assets in the United States is a gesture. It's not, it doesn't have any practical consequences. But on the other hand, there have been, and there are, Americans who have been drawn to organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas and others in the Middle East. And those Americans, if they give in to those urgings, will find themselves subject to criminal prosecution. So it has some effect as a deterrent. It has some effect as a symbol of condemnation. But you know, as you say, if Hezbollah does not have bank accounts in the United States, then what else can the United States do to indicate its disapproval? You can only do what is legally possible to do, and that's as far as you can go.
فيما يبدو أن العقوبات الأمريكية كانت مفيدة حينما فرضت على مسؤولين سياسيين لبنانيين مثل وزير الخارجية الأسبق جبران باسيل. دعنا نشرح للمتابع اللبناني والعربي هذه العقوبات وقدرتها القانونية العقابية القوية.
Again, they have several sort of modes. One of them is the freezing of assets. That is, a person who is on the specially designated terrorist list cannot, if he or she owns assets in the United States, cannot access them. That is, cannot take money out of the bank. That can be a significant deterrent, a significant gesture. Also, people are not permitted, Americans or others subject to the jurisdiction of the United States are not permitted to have financial transactions with that person, can't buy from him or sell to her. The person is, generally speaking, not permitted to enter the United States, which may have impact for people who have reason to want to come here, perhaps personal reasons, perhaps financial reasons, perhaps political reasons. They can't come. In fact, Ibrahim Raisi, as it happens, is on a list of people who are not permitted to enter the United States. And so with someone like Basil, certainly these kinds of sanctions, the very same kinds of sanctions, incidentally, that we were talking about a moment ago with respect to Hezbollah, they may have significant impact on an individual and may cause him or her to think twice about wanting to be involved with the kinds of activities and the kinds of collaborators that they've been associated with.
إذا لا يستطيع التحرك بحرية ولا زيارة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أو المشاركة في اجتماعات الأمم المتحدة مثلا.
Well, he can't come to the United States. Although, if he were to be head of state of Lebanon and did come to the United States, I guess he could attempt to argue that he's immune from U.S. law because heads of state typically are immune. I'm not sure how that would work. We would have two competing legal principles, right? One that says that he can't come in and one that says he's immune from law and therefore can. I think in all likelihood, if he were to become president of Lebanon, he would not be allowed to enter the United States. But that doesn't mean that he couldn't travel elsewhere. And it certainly doesn't mean that he couldn't attempt to govern Lebanon from Beirut. The United States doesn't control who is president of Lebanon, nor should we.
أصلاً كيف يمكن لشخص عليه عقوبات خارجية أن يصل للرئاسة؟ يعني هذه أصلاً نقطة جدل هنا في لبنان دكتور شبينم، لكن ما هي الإجراءات التي يمكن أن يتبعها الوزير جبران باسيل للتخلص من هذه العقوبات؟
Well, that would certainly not increase his popularity, I dare say, among sensible people in Lebanon. Although I can also imagine that among some people in Lebanon, the idea that he's under U.S. sanctions might be a positive thing. It might show his independence. It might show his resolve to protect the interests that he thinks are important. But again, if he were to be a serious candidate for the presidency, he would and his supporters would have to address to the Lebanese people the question of how well he could function given that he is subject to sanctions in the United States. And I'm not sure, frankly, what sanctions he may be subject to in other countries, but I would imagine that were he to become president of Lebanon, the United States would make a serious diplomatic effort to have allied countries also place him under sanctions. So there really isn't a legal procedure, a set of steps that someone has to follow. And there have not been many instances of individuals who are on the sanctions list removing themselves.
إذا فهمت منك جيدا بأنه ليس من السهل على السياسيين اللبنانيين الذين فرضت عليهم عقوبات أمريكية أن يتخلصوا منها بسهولة، هذا صحيح؟
It's not easy. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's not easy. Yes, that's correct.
وتأخذ مسار طويل وإجراءات معقدة، هل هذا صحيح؟
Yes, it would require a demonstration of someone actually having abandoned whatever kind of behavior put her or him on the list in the first place.
قضية انفجار مرفأ بيروت دعنا نتوقف عندها، خصوصا أن التحقيق الداخلي معلق منذ فترة طويلة بسبب التدخلات السياسية المحلية واتهام شخصيات نافذة في القضية، وهذا أغضب أهالي الضحايا وهم يطالبون الآن بلجنة تحقيق دولية أو محكمة دولية أو تقصي حقائق، لجنة تقصي حقائق كما حدث في قضية اغتيال رئيس الحكومة الأسبق رفيق الحريري. هل هذا ممكن؟
The best way I think for them to do that would not be, at least in the short run, to aim at the goal of prosecution of someone who is guilty of a crime. It would be very difficult, I think, to do that without some form of cooperation of the Lebanese government, and I'm not sure that that can be relied upon. But there are international complaint mechanisms. For example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Lebanon is a party, has a complaint mechanism whereby individuals claiming that their human rights have been violated may protest, may raise a complaint with the Human Rights Committee that sits in Geneva, and allege that the state, and it must be the state, not an individual, but the state has been involved in a systematic denial of rights. But certainly in the case of that explosion, if it could be demonstrated that the state or state elements were involved in the explosion or were involved in covering it up or were involved in allowing the conditions that led to the blast to continue in the face of evidence that there were an explosion waiting to happen, then I think it would be possible for that complaint to be pursued. I also think that on a diplomatic level, it would be more than appropriate for people who were injured, either directly or derivatively, to protest to countries that are more likely to be sympathetic with their concerns and have those raised within the United Nations structure. Now, is that as efficient as going to court? No, obviously it's not, but there is no court that has universal jurisdiction over such things.
وبما أن الدولة اللبنانية لن تتعاون في التحقيق وهذا واضح أصلا لحماية شخصيات سياسية، ماذا عن إمكانية تشكيل لجنة تحقيق، لجنة تقصي حقائق دكتور شبينم؟ هل يمكن الأمم المتحدة التدخل في هذه القضية لمساندة أهالي الضحايا والكشف عن الحقيقة من خلال هكذا لجنة؟ يعني عم يطالب فيها الأهالي منذ فترة كتير طويلة لأنه التحقيق ما في تحقيق، التحقيق عالق.
Yes, it is possible by all means. There is a United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. There is the treaty body mechanism that I mentioned earlier under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are means of authorizing United Nations agencies and representatives to carry out investigations. They've been done many times. And this may very well be a classic case in which that is exactly what should be done.
يعني إذا أرادت الأمم المتحدة مساعدة أهالي الضحايا فهذا ممكن من خلال لجنة تقصي حقائق، هذا صحيح؟
That is right. And in order to go before the International Criminal Court, at the end of the day, the requirement is that the Security Council needs to be involved, and one can assume that given Syria's role here and Syria's protector, Russia, has a veto in the Security Council, we can assume that nothing would ever be authorized by that route. But the the treaty body under the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, is not subject to veto. and were the General Assembly to authorize an investigation, that would not be subject to veto either. That would be a matter of majority rule. Same is true of activity by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So I think there are means of recourse. They may not be terribly efficient. They're not quick. They're not the kind of give and take that happens in a courtroom, an adversary proceeding that we hope leads to truth. But they're a whole lot better than nothing.
شكرا جزيلا ضيفي المحامي ستيفن شبينم من واشنطن.
It's my pleasure, Asma. Thank you very much for inviting me, and talk again sometime, I hope.
إن شاء الله.